Hi, welcome back again for our second session. I just wanted to begin by pointing out one little interesting item that I ran across. I was reading this magazine called American Scientist, and it has an article in it called How People Decide to Trust Science, which seemed relevant to this course. And the point that that this article is making is that it's not that people distrust all of science, because they don't have opinions about astrophysics and things like that, but rather that they distrust, or where the problems arise in trust is with science that is being used for regulations or for public policy. And so it's the science behind regulations and public policy that form the basis of the controversies over science. And of course, that is exactly what we're talking about in this course. And in particular, it is the topic of today's talk, which is discussing the controversy surrounding wildlife management, of which there are quite a few, as it turns out. Our speaker today is Samantha Wisely, Sam Wisely, who is from the Department of Wildlife Ecology in the College of Agriculture, and she is director of the Cervid Health Research Initiative and a professor in the Department of Wildlife Ecology, sorry. She was trained as a conservation geneticist, and she spends much of her time studying human impacts on the landscape and their effects on animals and livestock and the wildlife disease systems that are a threat to human health. She received her undergraduate degree from UC San Diego, master's from Humboldt State, and a PhD from the University of Wyoming, where she studied the black-footed ferret. She completed a postdoc at the Smithsonian and then took an assistant professor position at Kansas State University, and was there for some years, and then came here as an associate professor and the associate director of the Ordway Swisher Biological Station, and then did that for a few years, and then became a professor in wildlife ecology. So today she will be talking about science and politics of wildlife management. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and share with you a little bit of both my research, but also some of the extension work that I do in my appointment in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. And so when I was asked to give this talk, I was asked to speak on a controversial subject. And so I thought, why not wild pigs? They are much revered by the hunting community, and they are much vilified by just about everybody else. And so I thought I would sort of provide you this sort of case study of controversial wildlife management. It might not be on. There we go. I think it just turned itself off. So, particularly in the southeastern United States, wild pigs have a very firm place in Southern culture. There are mascots of restaurants and teams, high school, as well as semi-professional baseball. And then, of course, they provide this economic revenue in the form of hunting. People really enjoy to hunt. People have a lot of economic opportunities by providing hunts for wild boar. And so they are firmly entrenched here. Not only are you able to hunt them on public grounds, but there is a large number of private hunting grounds that also cultivate this hunting culture as well. And these are just publicly available hunts that are advertised on Google Maps. So I'm sure there are many more of them, but as you can see, they're spread all throughout Florida, right? From the tip of the panhandle down almost to the tip of the peninsula. And wild pigs are the second most popular game animal hunted in Florida, second only to white-tailed deer, more popular than turkey. So there is a lot of revenue to be made, not just from private outfitters, but also FWC, right? So they control these wildlife management areas. Most of the time, you don't have to have a hunting license to hunt wild pigs. FWC recognizes them as a non-native species, but they also consider them wildlife. So they have this sort of dual status. Some places, however, where they're extremely popular, they actually have bag limits on wild pigs. So they limit how many you can take so that they can keep those populations in perpetuity. People also really like to eat game meat. It is healthier than most of our livestock production animals. So here's just, they have more protein, they're lower in fat, they're lower in saturated fat, and they provide more iron, they're a little bit lower in calories. And so there is nutritional benefit to eating wild game. But they are also considered one of the world's worst invasive species. The World Conservation Union and Invasive Species Specialist Group have deemed them such. They literally exist on every continent but Antarctica. They are native to Eurasia. So where you see that in black, that is their native distribution, and the gray is where they exist today. So they are very widely distributed. In the United States, they were actually introduced by DeSoto in Port Charlotte. He brought 11 of them, and they have since spread. There have been other introductions as well. And they exist nearly in all states in the United States. And it's estimated that there's more than 5 million wild pigs throughout the United States. So as I mentioned, DeSoto brought 13 in 1539. Several years later, in somebody's journal, it was mentioned that there were 300 of them. So already we're starting to see inklings of exponential growth in these animals. Florida was an open range grazing system, meaning that there were no fences until almost the mid 1900s. So they really were allowed to increase their distribution without any stopping them. And it's estimated today that in Florida alone, there's over 1 million pigs. They are in every single county in Florida. And they really are the perfect invasive species. Like every quality that you would want in an invasive species, wild pigs have. They reproduce quickly. They're fertile by 8 months of age. They can have litters of 3 to 12, and they can reproduce 3 times in 15 months. They're a very generalist species. They can eat anything. They can live anywhere. They live from Mexico to Canada in North America. So they're not limited by temperature. And they're highly adaptable. They can learn to cope with almost any environment. And they're very intelligent. So wild pigs today in Florida exist really from a couple of different mechanisms and proliferate from a couple of different mechanisms. One is intentional releases. So, and that is both legal intentional releases and illegal intentional releases. So you actually can get a permit to trap a live wild pig, move it across the state, and then release it live as long as that is a high fenced property, meaning that that has certain qualities so wildlife can't move in and out. You can also do that illegally, putting it on property where you haven't received that permit. We also have a lot of people who have backyard pork and that is not particularly biosecure, meaning that there's not very good fences. And so there's a lot of domestic escapes. And wild pigs in one generation can ferilize very quickly. So they can very quickly both adapt and evolve to wild situations. And as I mentioned before, they're in every single county. So that's sort of the situation in Florida. We don't see too much European boar in Florida. It's a little bit too warm for them to do very well, but people have intentionally released them into northern parts of the United States for hunting opportunities. And some of these enormous wild boar that you see pictures of, those typically have a lot of wild boar, European boar genes in them. So I don't know, how many of you have seen wild pig damage, the rooting behavior that they do? It's pretty remarkable what they can do. People on golf courses report a lot of turf damage that occurs. They do terrible things to wetland ecosystems where they really use a lot of that for thermoregulation. So they create these wallows where they really change the hydrology of the system. People's yards, myself included, have been thoroughly rooted by wild pigs. And then they do lots of row crop damage as well. I was just talking with an extension agent in Washington County the other day, and peanuts and cotton are really hit hard by wild pigs. And so when I came to UF, I was really looking to understand this idea of wild pigs and how they fit into the social structure of Florida. And so I created this conceptual model to sort of help me wrap my head around it. This idea that there's social drivers, things like natural resource management, agricultural production, and human health, that all sort of put a lens on how we think about wild pigs. There's the impacts that the wild pigs do themselves, whether they be good things like increase hunting opportunities or bad things like increase the amount of diseases on the landscape. And the outcomes of all of those social drivers and impacts guide our behavior, and it's typically driven by monetary loss or gain. So that is often how we make our decisions. And it can be two things. It can be to manage for wild pigs, so regulate the population at some level, or control them, meaning trying to eradicate them. We don't really talk about eradication in Florida because we have so many pigs. We talk about controlling them to lower levels and creating pockets of pig-free areas. But the idea of elimination is really beyond what we could do. And by the way, if you have questions in the middle of this, please feel free and stop me.
We're used to waiting till the end, so I'll probably wait.
Okay. So what I'm going to do today and where I'm going to structure this talk is just sort of come back to this conceptual diagram a few times and talk about a few vignettes of studies that I have done in the past 11 or 12 years that I've been here, some different studies that I've conducted that sort of fit in different ways in this conceptual diagram. And really the first one I'm going to talk about, because it was sort of the easiest one to wrap my head around, was this idea of loss of resources in the agricultural production in Florida. And so when I first came here, I did a lot of work at Buck Island Ranch, which is a working cattle ranch associated with Archbold Biological Station. It's in Highland County, Florida. If you haven't been there before, it's absolutely gorgeous country. It's a research cattle ranch that is about 40,000 acres. It's a mixture of both improved pasture, but also some native grassland pasture land as well. And they had really been hit hard by wild pigs. And this is a little bit difficult to see, but all of these, this is from a helicopter, all of these dark patches within here are rooted areas from wild pigs. And so we did a couple of things. I had a graduate student who measured the forages, so all of the plants in areas that were rooted and in areas that were not rooted. And she had replicate measures of this all over the ranch. And she followed them for a year to see how long it took those rooted areas to recover to working pasture land. And the answer was, it really never did. So here's a graph here where this is the forage grass, the percent of forage grass in these plots that she measured, whether they were unrooted plots or rooted plots, over a course of 11 months. And you can see the rooted plots didn't really come back very well. The unrooted plots followed their own path. But in general, there was 60% less forage anywhere there was rooting in that area. And if we expanded that by these aerial surveys to see how much of the area was actually rooted, we calculated how much was lost in that area. And it was about $17,000 of pasture land lost a year. So we know how much pasture, how much acreage is needed to produce a pound of beef. And so that's how we calculated that. If we just sort of back of the napkin extrapolated that across all of the cattle lands in a 5-county area, which is the heart of cattle country in Florida, region-wide economic losses were between $2 million and $11 million per year. And so it wasn't, but shortly after we published this study that Likes Ranch, one of the largest landholders in that region, started to do aerial gunnery for pigs on his property. So we also were very interested in not just how much forage they were eating, natural forage, pasture land, but in the wintertime in Florida, cattle need to be supplementally fed, and that's typically with a molasses mixture. And so we set up some camera traps to actually look at it. So these are cameras that take a picture anytime it sees an animal in front of it. And we got a lot of pictures like this. We expected to see pigs and we expected to see cattle, but like they were both together there a lot of the time. That raises other questions that I'll get to in a minute, but we estimated the shared time at feeders, and it turned out that when we could exclude the cattle but keep the pigs there, they consumed up to 40% of that supplemental feed. And this also, and we were also able to show that there was quite a bit of overlap in how much they use when we didn't do exclusions, which also really brings up this idea of the potential for pathogen transmission between these two different species. So that sort of gave us an idea of, at least in the livestock arena, how pigs were impacting resources and production there. But it also brought up this idea of disease and what might be going on there. And so I'm going to tell you again a story about that involves natural resource management and disease, and really is one that's a little bit stickier. So in that first one, it's really easy to cast pigs as the villain in this, right? They cause economic losses and they promote disease. But this one is a little bit different, and it has caused dilemma in Florida within our natural resource managing agencies. All right, so let me set the stage for this. It also impacts a very charismatic, threatened and endangered species and human health. So there are 45 known pathogens that are shared between wild pigs and other species. So there's shared pathogens with humans, things like that cause brucellosis or toxoplasmosis. I can run you through the list, but there's a lot of them. Wild pigs can also impact the pork industry, right? They're the same species. And so we can see a lot of pathogens that are shared between them. I'm not going to talk today about African swine fever very much, but needless to say, that is the pathogen people are looking at on the horizon. There's a global pandemic of African swine fever, and it's in the Caribbean, and people are worried that it's going to get into wild pigs here in Florida. Because wild pigs are hunted very often with dogs, there are pathogens that are shared between carnivores, which dogs are, and wild pigs, things like leptospirosis and pseudorabies. What I'm going to talk about today is some of the pathogens that wild pigs share with threatened and endangered species, and in particular, that of the Florida panther. Before I do that, though, I did just want to mention that we talk about eating game meat and the benefits of that, but you do have to be very careful. Brucella suis, which causes brucellosis in people, is the #1 zoonotic disease in Florida after Lyme disease, if you call that a zoonotic disease. So it exists, and most of these cases are from hunters who've acquired it. There's a small number of them that have acquired it from unpastured dairy. Okay, but I've alluded to this idea of Florida panthers and wild pigs. Just so we're all on the same page, we all know and love Florida panthers, but they used to be quite broadly distributed around the southeastern United States, and now they're really confined to South Florida. And mostly here in this area, but we are really starting to see them move more northward, and we've actually seen breeding females move towards Central Florida as well. So that's very exciting, right? The recovery of an endangered species that had this pretty precarious start that I won't talk about today, but needless to say, this is exciting news. So in Florida, wild pigs are the most abundant prey item in the Florida panther diet. So particularly in the southern part, they are the #1 prey item. And so Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission manages them in the southern part of the state for panther populations. So remember how I told you they put bag limits on some of these wildlife management areas for pigs? That's in the southern part of the state where they really want to keep the numbers of wild pigs quite high for these guys. And this is a little bit hard to see, but that is a wild pig butt that is about to be chomped on by a Florida panther. Okay, so this is a busy map, so let me walk you through this. So many Florida panthers have radio collars on them, or GPS collars that takes telemetry points on them. And when a Florida panther dies, that radio collar or telemetry collar, the signal changes. When the collar hasn't moved for a long time, it's called a mortality signal. And Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission runs out and picks up that carcass so they can determine the cause of death of that animal. And it turns out that pseudorabies virus was suspected in many of these cases. And so my lab actually used some newer technologies to help them confirm some of these probable and suspect cases. And so this is a map then of all of the Florida panthers that have died of pseudorabies. So these are the ones that are 100% we're sure of. These green points are everywhere that we've located Florida panther. The orange are probable cases, and the yellow are suspect. We were able to turn all of these into red. Every single one of these turned out to be a pseudorabies case. Pseudorabies is a natural disease of wild pigs. It's a herpes virus that's naturally carried by pigs. It gives them, just like herpes virus does in humans, it gives them a little cold sore. It doesn't make them very sick. But when it goes into a different species, it makes that other species very sick. That is sort of the nature of herpes viruses. And so it turns out, after we were able to confirm a bunch of these cases, that pseudorabies virus is the 3rd leading cause of death in Florida panthers. The first one is what we would call intra-species aggression. That's almost always male-on-male violence. The second one is vehicular collision, and then it's pseudorabies virus. So this really changed the way we were thinking about pigs and their role in Florida panther health. So between 9 and 22% of mortalities now from pseudorabies virus. And so that really begged the question, well, how widely distributed is pseudorabies virus in Florida? And this pseudorabies virus and the disease it causes in carnivores, a Shosky's disease, how widely would animals be susceptible to that? So any carnivore, whether it's a bear or a raccoon or a dog or a cat, is highly susceptible to that. Humans are not susceptible to it. This is not a human disease. And so we measured this in two ways. So first of all, the first way we looked was what we would call seroprevalence, meaning that we looked for antibodies in the blood of wild pigs. So that would suggest that an animal had seen pseudorabies virus and had mounted an antibody response. And for something like a herpes virus, that actually means that it's probably a carrier of that virus, because once you get a herpes virus, you have it for life. So this suggests the carrier state of these wild pigs. And we can see that there's some hot areas. But statewide, every population that we measured was about 50% positive, right? That's pretty high. But then we also wanted to know, right? So herpes virus, as we all know, can reactivate. If you get super stressed out, you can actually get that cold sore back again. And that means you're actually infectious at that time. So pigs can be a carrier and feel fine and they're not shedding the virus. And so they're not infectious. Or they can be a little bit stressed out. Maybe they're pregnant, maybe they're lactating, maybe they're being chased by a dog, and they become infectious and they're shedding virus. So we just took one snapshot in time of to ask whether or not animals were shedding virus. And this is what we found. So highly variable. Some populations had animals that were shedding virus a lot and some very little. And it was really interesting to us, like, why are some of these populations have like these hot populations that are highly infectious? So really, in some ways, this then gives us a bit of a risk assessment for Florida panthers, right? If these are populations where they're shedding virus, that's a higher likelihood that they could actually get the virus. So we asked a really simple question. Given all of these areas, we looked at actually the carrier states. So whether animals, pigs, were carrying antibodies to pseudorabies virus. And we divided all of these populations into whether they were populations that were hunted just by firearm, meaning it was probably a less stressful way to be hunted than if you're being chased by a dog, right? So riflery versus being chased by a dog. Because our hypothesis was that more stressed out populations would be shedding the virus and it would be transmitted around them more. So they would have more pseudorabies in the environment. And that's exactly what we found. So as you can see here, juveniles, subadults, adults, all populations combined, the seroprevalence in areas where they allowed dog hunts was statistically higher than places where they did not allow dog hunts. And this is cool because what this means is that you can actually change a management action and potentially lower the pseudorabies status in an area. And so that's exactly what we suggested to Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, where they were able to change some of their hunting regulations, both on J.W. Corbett Wildlife Management Area, where they had bag limits and allowed huge dog hunts, and also Spirit of the Wild Wildlife Management Area. So both of these, as you can see, are in the highest area of Florida panther habitat or in an expanding area of Florida panther habitat. Okay, so kind of complicated, right? Not just an easy yes or no answer. Pigs are good, but pigs can also be bad. So things get complicated when it comes to ethics and controversies. All right, so I'll come back to some less controversial things like human health and water quality. So wild pigs are attracted to water. They actually don't have the ability to thermoregulate. They don't sweat. They don't have sweat glands. So they require water in order to thermoregulate. And so that's why they do this wallowing behavior. They roll around in the mud to get cool. In the action of that, they can change things like the sedimentation of an area, the turbidity, and then they can also input their fecal matter, which carry diseases. And so water sources can, of course, then transport these swine-borne diseases throughout the environment, right? And they can do it way up here at the top of the watershed and impact things that are further away from them. The classic story of this is toxoplasmosis. So we know in Monterey Bay, feral cats that poop in the watershed way up here transport toxoplasma all the way down here where they infect sea otters and do a lot of damage to sea otters. So water quality and feral animals are a bad mix. So really, this is just a literature review that we've done. So we just sort of looked for the intersection of human-borne and pig-borne diseases that can impact humans that are carried by water, that are waterborne pathogens. And we found 13 of them, viruses, bacteria, protozoans, and fungi that can impact human health that are carried by pigs and transported by water. And in particular, we have now seen an increase of leptospira, which causes leptospirosis in Floridians over the last 10 to 15 years. But poor water quality can also impact whole guilds of animals that rely on high water quality, things like native fauna like Florida salamanders. So all throughout the panhandle, we have endemic species of salamanders that are impacted not just by the water quality, but they can also be eaten by these guys as well. So this brings me to another study that we did where we looked at wild pig diet. And we were using a pretty new methodology here where we actually are looking for the DNA of the prey items in the poop of wild pigs. And so I sent out a bunch of my graduate students to collect wild pig poop at Buck Island Ranch. We brought it back to the lab, and then we used this sort of what we call a meta barcoding technique where we just had specific DNA tags that allowed us to identify all these different species that turned up in the poop of these wild pigs. We got that from 200 pig fecal samples at Buck Island Ranch, and we found a lot of things in them. What amazed us the most, so there were 12 endemic species that we could see had been eaten by wild pigs. So things like American alligator, probably their eggs, green anoles, lots of frogs, lots of toads, so a fair number of amphibians, which surprised us. 4 endangered species, so those are the ones that are in red, gopher tortoise, probably eggs, could be small babies, but then lots of fish, lots of endangered endemic Florida fish. So they are really hitting these aquatic wetland areas really hard. These are all really sensitive species throughout Florida. These habitats are very sensitive. And if we want to see a sunny side, they actually were eating another invasive species, an invasive species eating an invasive species. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the social drivers. I've talked to you about some of the impacts. And now I just want to think a little bit about the outcomes. So how do we manage for these species in Florida? And how do we make some traction with some of the impacts that they have made? So it's again, this idea of balancing increased hunting opportunities with loss of resources, no matter what they are, human health resources or natural resources. And all of these are going to guide management decisions that we make for wild pigs. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the regulatory aspects of wild pigs. I had alluded to them before, but there's really three agencies in Florida that manage for wild pigs. The first is Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, right? So they manage all of the wild pig hunts on public lands. And that's really their bread and butter for how they can manage them, by saying you can shoot as many of them as you want, or we're going to put a bag limit on them so they can increase hunting opportunities or decrease hunting opportunities via that mechanism of hunting. The middle icon here is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So if a wild pig is on your land, it's considered your livestock. That is the regulatory landscape that we live in. So if you have a wild pig on your property, it's considered your livestock, and you, as I mentioned before, you are able to transport that legally if you have a permit, and if the recipient has a permit and a high fence. So it is that it's managed like livestock. So that's why it's under FDACS. USDA, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, has a branch called Wildlife Services, and they do animal control all throughout the United States. So they're in charge of animal control and depredation. And so on public lands, they do that for federal or state agencies. They can also do it on private lands. So they were the ones who did aerial gunnery on the Likes Ranch. So they're in helicopters, they see animals on the ground, and they use aerial gunnery to control them. And they are experts at it. They get hundreds of hours of training in order to do these things. But it turned out that nobody was talking to each other, right? They were just all angry with each other for the way they were managing differently because they had different mandates. And so in 2018, the incentive to form a Florida wild pig task force really sort of came to a head, really as a result of thinking about how we were going to manage Florida panthers in light of some of these results that we had found. And so these were a series of facilitated workshops, really mostly to just understand where everybody was coming from and to make some decisions about what would go on. And one of the things that came out of this is that, not everybody has USDA's ability to call them up and say, hey, can you do aerial gunnery on my land? A lot of people live in, say, homeowners associations, and in Florida, those can be huge acreages. Individuals can have huge acreage within those homeowner associations, but also the homeowners associations can be really large. I just went down to one in Kissimmee to consult with them on wild pigs, and it was 5,000 acres. So, I mean, big chunks of land. So myself and a colleague, Hans Ellington, really targeted two groups to sort of get a better understand of our stakeholders. HOAs, that's what I was interested in, and Hans works at the Ona Cattle and Range Station, and so he was very interested in ranchers. And we conducted surveys of needs and attitudes of them. How do you like wild pigs? Do you not like wild pigs? What are your impediments to animal control if you did want to control them? And so from there, we're still in the middle of sort of analyzing all those data. We've sent the surveys out, we've gotten them back. But really what we'd like to do is design some private landowner assistance programs to help them control their own animals, because the feasibility is a huge hurdle. And so that's all I've got for you. Thank you very much.
Well, very interesting, and it's so complicated. If you
Yes.
actually wanted to manage them, that's very, okay, questions. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. You mentioned pseudo rabies, which
Mhm.
I didn't know anything about, and I just Googled quickly to see whether there was any spillover to humans, and there's some discussion about it getting into causing encephalitis. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not familiar with that, and it certainly hasn't been what people have talked about in the literature too much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just
It
curious.
certainly causes encephalitis in carnivores.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
One of our Zoom questions is, why are humans not susceptible to the virus?
Yeah, I don't have a great answer for that. I mean, I think there's things that we are and things that we're not susceptible to. That's just one of them.
Yes, I have a question about brucellosis
Yeah,
from eating wild game.
yeah.
Can that be controlled by proper cooking, or is it not dealing with cooking?
Absolutely, it can. I always tell people I'm a proponent of eating wild game. I control wild pigs on my own property, and I eat the meat that I pull off of my property. And so I think of it, all of the same things that people tell you about chicken and salmonella. It would be the same thing that you would do, right? You want to use well, for pigs, you want to use gloves. You never want your animals to come into contact because there's pseudo rabies. They can also get brucella as well. Clean all of your surfaces very thoroughly and make sure you cook the meat to that proper internal temperature.
And then I had a question about fencing. What kind of fencing is necessary to control these pigs?
So USDA will tell you that, so there is something called pig fencing that you can put up, and you'd probably want to put it down several feet. And so, what does that cost per yard? I mean, it's super expensive. It is super expensive. So I think in some areas it might be practical, but in many, many, many cases, it's not practical.
Another Zoom question is, do you have any tips on how to discourage them from coming into your yard?
Yeah, I'd be a millionaire if I had tips on how to discourage them from your yard. I really don't. I don't often understand why they come into my yard. It seems like there's certain areas that they just love, and I can only think that maybe there's a certain grub or a certain rhizome that they really enjoy to eat. But yeah, I don't have yeah, yeah.
What is the interaction between the pigs in the Everglades and the pythons?
Oh, what a good question. I have no idea. I mean, we know that pythons are denuding the Everglades of all vertebrates, right? Particularly large-bodied vertebrates. And I can't imagine they're not having an impact on them. They seem like they would be great food for some of those larger individuals. But we don't see people that do a lot of surveys. The pigs down there, the ones that the panthers are eating the most, are the populations of pigs that we know the least about.
There's another question on Zoom. Let's see. Okay. Has hunting with dogs been prohibited in Florida? And if so, where? What is the status of this type of control action?
So no, hunting with dogs is not prohibited. I think last year was the first year where they required GPS collars on all dogs so that they could be recalled more quickly and more easily. So and there have been a couple of wildlife management areas, like I showed you, where they have prohibited them, but it is firmly embedded in Southern culture, and there are very strong lobbyist groups that are very pro-dog. pro dog hunting.
I don't think it's pro dog.
If the pigs are on your property and they're assumed to be your livestock, can you kill them and, without having to report?
Absolutely, absolutely. I do, and I do that. But so I'm an HOA member. We all have between 10 and 30 acres. I live just right around Micanopy. And we joined forces together. We bought a very fancy trap. This trap has panels and it has a webcam, because the most effective way to trap pigs is to trap the entire sounder group. I could give you a whole talk on this. So a whole sounder group, right? A sounder is a behavioral group that interacts together. It's usually a mom and a bunch of her babies. If you can wipe out one of those whole sounders, you're good for about 10 months is what we've found before another group moves in and you have to do it again. I don't have to tell anybody that. Now, in some areas, you might have to deal with firearm laws, right? Because then you have to dispatch them once they're in your trap. But that's a different question from whether or not you can kill animals on your own property. You certainly can't do that with all wild animals, but wild pigs are considered livestock, yes.
We have a question on Zoom. Christina, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Nina.
Okay, we'll come back to Christina. Do we have another one here, Jane?
Here we go. Yes, Paul. Oh, okay. There you go.
You already answered one of my questions, the simple one. You mentioned two crops where they are especially prone to root. One was peanuts, which makes sense. The other was cotton. Why cotton?
I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, it could be something, it's a rooting behavior, so maybe it's something in the roots that they're after. Yeah, I don't have a good reason for that.
Sam, that was a great talk, well, not introducing us, letting us know current status of feral hogs. And I thought I would ask the audience, first of all, a question. How fast do you think feral pigs can move? Yeah. The answer to that is probably in excess of 75 miles an hour. Those are the ones that travel up I-75. Because earlier on, Sam had mentioned the fact that there's a trade whereby you move hogs from one area to another. And of course, they also move across state lines. And that's when issues become pretty important. And in the 80s, we studied, because of this disease, African swine fever, and other diseases like foot and mouth disease, we studied the issue of trying to vaccinate feral hogs. And I introduce now the topic of vaccination. I'll be talking to you later about this. But we had a proposal whereby we could actually look at the potential using research that's associated with recombinant DNA. We could produce vaccines that could actually neuter feral hogs. So we put a proposal up to USDA, and it was subsequently reviewed. And in fact, it was turned down because of the ethics of trying to control a feral pig population. Now, the issue that I would say is that this is a misunderstanding of science, because this is an invasive species, it's a feral species, it does not belong in Florida. So I would like to ask the audience, what do you think?
But any thoughts on this? But as Sam just told us,
Wait,
The grounds upon which it was turned down, and it was a research proposal at this point, was that it is inappropriate to attempt to control the natural reproduction of an animal. But the question is, this animal does not belong in Florida. And Sam has pointed out to you why it doesn't belong in Florida.
Wait, let's get the mic. While we're moving the mic, one comment says, if you can neuter them humanely, I'd say do it.
There are programs to control the pythons, so why not the pigs? They're both invasive, both from outside and are taking over.
And as Sam pointed out, they are the main food of the panther and maybe some other creatures. Any
Jane, there's
other
a
thought?
couple comments here if you want to read them, or I can.
Okay. How do we explain the cattle industry if you can't control the natural reproduction of animals? Well, they're not natural, I suppose. How well received have the studies been and have your efforts, ideas? I think that's for ideas been rejected as fake science or otherwise discredited. That's from Neil. A different question, yeah.
Yeah. I, knock on wood, have not had to deal too much with the idea of fake science in this project. Certainly, we have in others. Um, I yeah, I think it hasn't come to head in that manner so far. There's still plenty of hunting opportunities for wild pigs in Florida. So we have that right to hunt pigs has not been infringed upon. I do think the dog hunters have a bone to pick with legislators on occasion, but in general, they also still have opportunities as well. So I mean, it has been a real balance. I mean, a real balancing act that everyone has tried to do. And it's trying to meet the mandate of all the citizens of Florida, right? There, as I've pointed out, there's different mandates for different reasons. It's complicated. I mean, I don't know that there is one answer.
Yeah. All the stakeholders, yeah.
Okay, I have a question about the ranchers.
Mm.
That they must have a stake in this too, and when the feral pigs sort of root out their places. Now, I'm not talking about the research person. I'm talking about a guy that's making a living. And so, what does the typical rancher do, if you know? Or
Yeah.
I mean, when a feral does he get a hunter, or does he hire somebody to blow them away? Or does he do something?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's a very interesting dynamic that happens. So I would say even earlier in the 21st century, because we really have seen, I mean, exponential increases exponentially. So the problem has become a lot worse even in the last 10 years. But traditionally, ranchers in Florida have leased out their lands to hunters, and they generate revenue from hunts. And they often have very nice accommodations, and they often even do outfitting. So they are part of that pig hunting culture as well. And I think, they always saw themselves as generating more revenue from that than what they lost from forage loss. And I think that is just starting to tilt. I think they're just starting to come around and see that, with some of these big operators now actually really becoming on board. When I first came to Florida, they were very reluctant to do anything about pigs on their land, very reluctant. And that has changed. Those attitudes have changed.
There's another question on Zoom about, I guess, with considering the effects on water quality, has this had any effect on manatees?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know that anybody's looked at that.
The water's too cold, I suppose.
Well, it'd be interesting to know if some of those pathogens have impacts on manatees. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, but that would be something to investigate for sure.
And then Jane, we had a couple. We have Lynn and Steve back there.
One thought that occurred to me as you were talking is, states on various other regulatory type issues leave it up to counties. Has there been any discussion in the state legislature about allowing the various counties to get rid, well, they can't get rid of it, but either allow them or not allow them.
So I haven't heard anything in the
As far
state
as hunting, yeah.
legislature.
Mhm.
I'll tell you what, my own experience has been that, so my property abuts up to an Alachua County-owned property, Bar Hammock Preserve. And they have been very reticent to control wild pigs. And they've actually spoken with USDA about doing it, but not, I mean, they've said that for the past 7 years that they're talking to USDA about doing something. And I think the budgets are too small for one thing. And then I think there's just a lack of will to do it.
My question is about calling this an invasive species. They've been here almost 500 years.
Yeah.
So after 500 years, is it really invasive anymore?
Yeah, that's a good question. And a lot of people argue that it's not. I would argue that, evolutionary time is probably longer than 500 years. And so some of these species that they're wiping out, and some of the natural predators that existed where they involved that actually kept those populations in check are not here. And so, yeah, I do think they're an invasive species. They certainly impact our environment the way you would expect something that hadn't evolved here would. Not just them, but also their diseases, right?
That's what is an invasive species is an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
Considering the fast reproduction, is it possible to control the wild population?
So as I said at the top of the talk, we will never eradicate wild pigs from Florida. There's just too many of them, and they do reproduce so really fast. So there's an interesting number that people throw out. So okay, so I told you how fast they reproduce. They reproduce when they're between 6 and 8 months old. They can pop out 12 at a time, and they can do it one after another. The number that modelers throw out there is that you have to control 70% of a population before you start to see any dent in a decline in that population. So hunters themselves are not going to control the species, right? They do not, you could put a bounty on them and they're not going to get 70%. It takes professionals to get that sort of, and that's why fertility drugs, I think, are really difficult, because you would really have to give that to a lot of females in order to see a good decrease in population size. But we can take them out of pockets, taking them out of Pinellas County, taking them out of some of our island populations. That has been very successful.
Oh, yeah, like Cumberland Island is trying to get rid of them.
Mm-hmm. And
That-
they should be successful. They've been off Jekyll for, gosh, almost 50 years.
Yeah, and that's something we haven't mentioned is that they love to eat sea turtle eggs if they're down on the
Mhm.
beach.
Mhm.
So, any other questions? Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Interesting
Yeah.
talk. Very interesting.
So much.